As you know, the topic for this week in our course is regulatory and ethical considerations in pharmacy. So we're going to start our first content video module talking about state regulations, which is a very important part of how pharmacists are regulated in the United States. I want to first think with you about this Pharmacy Fundamental Pharmacy Practice Acts. So we'll describe these as state-specific kind of pieces of legislation that kind of govern the day-to-day aspects of pharmacy practice within each state. And really, Pharmacy Practice Acts are built around three basic components. One of these is organizational law, another one is licensing law, and the third is drug law. So what I'd like to do is give you some examples of what might be in a typical Pharmacy Practice Act relating to these three buckets, just to give you an idea of what these Pharmacy Practice Acts constitute. So first let's think about organizational law, and that is primarily a description of the Board of Pharmacy in a state, and we'll describe that to you as a pharmacy fundamental later. How it's set up, what its functions are, what its membership is, and how they are appointed. That's the organizational law piece by and large. There's a bunch of stuff under licensing law, so here are some things that you might see in a typical licensing law section of a Pharmacy Practice Act. Things like, what are the examination requirements for pharmacists? What is the pharmacy practice experience requirement to be able to take that license? How are interns registered? And interns, we are now meeting student pharmacists who have not yet completed their training, and they're not yet registered as a practicing pharmacist, but they're learning. So how do we register them? How do we license them? How do we regulate their preceptors who are training them and their training sites? We also have under licensing law things related to foreign pharmacist licensure. And then we have licensure transfer procedures. If I get licensed in my state of Ohio, how do I transfer that license to another state? We also have license renewal procedures. Typically, license must be renewed every year, and we go through a process to do that is state-specific. I mentioned to you a pharmacy fundamental earlier in the course, and that was continuing education. This is the education that a professional would need to complete to maintain their license over time, CPE, Continuing Pharmacist Education. And the Pharmacy Practice Act under licensing law would include requirements for that. How much do we need to do each year, and how is that reported, and so forth. The licensing law piece would have procedures for disciplining and licensed pharmacists. So how do we, if someone breaks the law, if they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, how do we deal with that, and how are they disciplined, and is there a hearing process, and so forth. This part of the Pharmacy Practice Act would include typically status of pharmacy technicians. It would include how we license pharmacies. It would include things also like how we license wholesale distributors. So a lot of things around licensing law that would occur in a Pharmacy Practice Act. And again, remember, we're thinking about state regulations, so this is all state-specific. And then the last big bucket is drug law. So things like, what are the drug control requirements in that state? Drug product selection requirements. So we mentioned earlier on that we have things like substitution laws. How can we do generic and or therapeutic substitution? That's state-specific and would be included here. What are the prescription requirements? What are the components of a legal prescription state by state? How do we transmit these prescriptions, either electronically or in paper form? There are patient counseling requirements that are state-specific. Prescribing authority, who can prescribe? Who can dispense? Dispensing authority, and things like, who can give immunizations? Can pharmacists give immunizations, and which ones? And also collaborative practice authority. So we've talked about the whole idea of collaborative practice a lot. So I want you to understand that each state has a Pharmacy Practice Act. This governs most of what pharmacists do on a day-to-day basis, and it changes a little bit from state to state. Part of that Pharmacy Practice Act, as we discussed, was boards of pharmacy, and I've got that as a pharmacy fundamental for you today. And this board of pharmacy, sometimes it's called something a little different in specific states, but they are there to help kind of govern the practice of pharmacy. They are here primarily to protect the public, and that's what we need to understand, that they're going to make sure that the good people of the state of Ohio or whatever state you happen to be in are protected from people who are not competent, who are doing kind of unethical things. And they typically do 4 or 5 different things. So you'll see on this slide that they were involved in licensure. So each state will set up their own licensure requirements. We'll see how that works in our next video module. And there are slightly different requirements state by state, and they govern that. They will govern what kind of continuing education we need to follow to keep that license. They help establish the rules that we follow. They take in that Pharmacy Practice Act, and we're going to talk about that here more in a minute. They would complete disciplinary hearings. So if I, as a practicing pharmacist, do something wrong, how do we deal with that? And typically there may be a hearing with the board, there may be disciplinary actions, license revocation, those sorts of things. And in some states, not all, the state board has actually law enforcement capability where they would actually go in and investigate pharmacies or even physicians' offices that are dispensing and writing prescriptions, maybe even bring cases to court and criminal cases in some cases that would be against a practitioner. So these are boards of pharmacy. I want to think about that box rules for a minute and let's think just for a few minutes about how that works. Typically a rule is generated in a state based on a piece of legislation, first of all. So the state government, the House of Representatives or whatever that may be, issues a new law, a new piece of legislation. And then that piece of legislation is translated into rules that the practitioners in that area must follow. I'm going to give you an example. In 2008, we had a tragic incident in the state of Ohio where a beautiful young girl, 2-year-old patient named Emily Jerry, tragically died from a medication error. It was an awful case, and there's actually been an Emily Jerry Foundation that came out of this in which they're trying to make positive changes to prevent these sorts of accidents from happening again and trying to make our medication safety systems safer and doing the things that would make that happen. But when that tragic accident occurred, our state of Ohio issued a piece of legislation which became known as Emily's Law. And this developed for the first time in our state rules surrounding the use of pharmacy technicians. And it said that pharmacy technicians, because a pharmacy technician made a product that hurt Emily Jerry, and by the way, that product was, of course, checked by a pharmacist, so the pharmacist was involved in this process as well. But at that time, we had no requirements for certification and kind of parameters around who could be technicians in this state. This all changed because of Emily Jerry. Well, the piece of legislation was transferred into specific rules, and things like, you must be 18 years of age or older, you must have a high school diploma or equivalent, you must pass an examination that is approved by the board, they must do a criminal background check, all these sorts of things, and then laid out kind of specific things that a technician can do as a qualified pharmacy technician and things that they can't do. So that's just an example of how that rules process tends to work. I want to mention to you, and I think we've mentioned it to you already in the course, this group called NABP, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. And this group works to support the works in our states. They help develop the licensure examinations that we'll talk about in our next video. They help in the transfer of license between states. They have some role in that. They help us assess pharmacists in this licensure process to determine if they have met the minimum qualifications to be a practitioner. And they also do some accreditation activities that we'll see as we talk about this slide. So NABP is important in terms of that state regulation piece. They issue, as you can see here, Model State Pharmacy Practice Act and rules. So, a state board in whatever state can look at some of these model pieces of rules to help them develop their own things that will be consistent with other practices. They offer the NAPLEX exam, the MPJE, and the FPGEE. This is the North American Pharmacist Licensure Examination, the Multi-State Pharmacy Jurisprudence Exam, and the Foreign Pharmacy Graduate Equivalency Exam. We'll talk more about those in our next video. They help operate the process through which we can transfer our license between states. They have a thing called CPE Monitor, which helps us to register and monitor our continuing education activities. And then they accredit a variety of things. They accredit wholesalers, internet pharmacy practice sites, durable medical equipment sales, and things like that. That is NABP. By the way, In those licensure examinations, NAPLEX, MPJE, and the Foreign Pharmacy Graduate Equivalency Exam, they also give, in some cases, pre-examinations for the NAPLEX and the Foreign Pharmacy Graduate Exam that would allow us to kind of prepare for the examination. So they help us as a practitioner get ready as well. Our pharmacy fundamentals for this module, the first one was Pharmacy Practice Act. This is a state-specific legislation concerning the regulation of the practice of pharmacy and related matters. And then we described to you Board of Pharmacy. And this is a governmental body empowered to regulate pharmaceutical practices, including granting and disciplining license of individuals and companies. As we go into our discussion forums this week, I'd like you to think about this question. The primary purpose of the Board of Pharmacy, as we have described it, is the protection of the public. My question to you is, how do they do that? I'll see you next time.